You know, you've made a bad decision when your grand military plan could be ruined by lunch. And not metaphorically. We're talking literal lunch. Because in 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered most of Europe, decided to invade Russia with 600,000 men, marching thousands of miles through hostile territory. And somehow nobody packed enough food. Yeah, the guy who planned to dominate an empire forgot that humans need to eat. Picture Europe at the start of the 19th century. Napoleon's empire is basically the Wi-Fi of power. It's everywhere. France doesn't just rule France. It controls half the continent. He's the kind of overachiever who makes everyone else's success look small. Except one problem: Russia. Tsar Alexander I had once been Napoleon's buddy. They'd even signed a peace treaty. But as with most political friendships, things got awkward fast. Russia didn't like how France was bossing everyone around. Napoleon didn't like being ignored, and before you know it, boom. Europe's two biggest egos are giving each other the cold shoulder, literally. Now, Napoleon wasn't just ambitious. He was allergic to being told no. So he decided to teach Russia a lesson. With the largest army Europe had ever seen, his plan? Cross into Russia, smash the Tsar's army, take Moscow, and force peace before winter. Easy, except Russia. Now, if you've ever Googled biggest military mistakes in history, you already know that invading Russia in the winter is like trying to microwave metal. It's a bad idea, but apparently irresistible. But here's the twist. Napoleon didn't plan to fight in winter. He thought it'd be over he thought the Russians would surrender. He thought logistics would sort themselves out. And if you're noticing a pattern here, yes, it's called wishful thinking. So in June 1812, Napoleon gathers what he calls the Grande Army, 600,000 soldiers from across Europe. French, Germans, Italians, Poles, basically everyone but the Russian. It's not just an army, it's a moving city. A city that needs, about 1 million pounds of food per day. And yet, the supply plan was about as solid as a wet baguette. The idea was simple on paper. They'd bring some food and live off the land. Just take whatever they needed from local villages along the way. Which sounds efficient, unless you realize Russian villages were burning themselves down to keep Napoleon's army from using them. Imagine organizing the biggest picnic in history and discovering the park is on fire. The French soldiers started calling Russia the land of no bread. They ran out of rations within weeks. Horses dropped dead from exhaustion or starvation. And since horses were also food, let's just say menus got creepy. Meanwhile, Russian forces kept retreating, destroying crops and towns behind them. Napoleon called it cowardice. Historians call it a masterclass in making your enemy starve. And just to be clear, Napoleon had logisticians. He had maps, wagons, and enough paperwork to build a fort. But here's the fun part. Nobody thought to calculate how long it would take to feed 500,000 men while marching across a country roughly the size of the moon. The result? Soldiers spent more time scavenging than fighting. Entire divisions stopped to raid potato fields or loot abandoned barns. The Grand Army turned into Grand Grocery Hunt. Still, Napoleon kept marching. Because for him, retreat wasn't in the vocabulary, though starvation definitely should have been. In early September, he finally reached Borodino, where the Russians decided to make a stand. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the Napoleonic Wars. Tens of thousands died. And yet, nobody really won. Napoleon technically held the field, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. His army was exhausted, supplies gone, and winter whispering, "Hey, remember me?" But he pressed on anyway, to Moscow. Because if he took the Russian capital, surely the Tsar would surrender, right? Right? Wrong. The Russians had evacuated Moscow and burned it down. Napoleon arrived expecting a grand prize, maybe a parade or at least a decent dinner. Instead, he found a ghost city of ashes. No food, no shelter, no peace treaty, just smoke, snow, and 100,000 soldiers wondering who forgot to bring the sandwiches. At this point, Napoleon's genius plan had turned into the world's worst camping trip. He'd conquered a country that refused to exist. And with winter closing in, he had two options: stay and freeze. March back home, starving, surrounded, and already halfway doomed. Spoiler, neither went well. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he expected to dine in the palaces of czars. Instead, he dined on disappointment and occasionally horse meat. The city was silent, blackened, and burning. The Russians had torched it themselves, leaving behind only smoke and a moral victory. Napoleon walked through the ashes like a man who'd thrown the world's most expensive party and realized nobody showed up. He waited. Days turned into... Surely, he thought, Tsar Alexander would send peace terms. But the Tsar, sitting warm and smug hundreds of miles away, simply said no for 40 days. The French army sat in the ruins of Moscow, living off whatever they could scavenge: moldy grain, burnt flour, and occasionally the odd pigeon unlucky enough to land nearby. Imagine 600,000 men reduced to foraging through rubble, arguing over the ownership of a single loaf of bread. Soldiers roasted rats over campfires in marble courtyards. Officers tried to maintain dignity by eating their horse with silver forks. Meanwhile, the Russian winter began to arrive, fashionably late but utterly merciless. Temperatures dropped, snow fell. The French soldiers' elegant uniforms, designed for style over survival, turned into ice sculpture. Napoleon, still refusing to admit defeat, declared they would stay until the Tsar surrendered, which, to be fair, was only slightly less delusional than believing Moscow had a secret buffet hidden somewhere. Finally, reality punched through the frostbite. With no supplies, no peace, and an army wasting away, Napoleon ordered the retreat. It was October. Winter had only just begun, and 600,000 men began the long, slow journey home through a country they had already stripped bare. They left Moscow in columns that stretched for miles, hungry, freezing, and dragging what was left of their wagons. The horses, once proud and strong, collapsed one by one, either eaten or abandoned. By the time they reached the first major river crossing, the snow was waist-deep, and discipline had evaporated like their ration. You'd think, after centuries of human history, someone would have written this down as a rule: never invade a place where vodka free. But no. Apparently, every great conqueror needs to learn that lesson the hard way. As the army trudged west, hunger became the true enemy. Entire regiments dissolved into chaos. Men raided each other's supplies. Horses became currency. A single bag of flour was worth more than gold. And then came the frostbite, the kind that didn't just hurt but erased fingers, ears, and hope. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags, marched on frozen stumps, and dreamed of bread. At night, they huddled together for warmth and told themselves they'd survive until morning. Many didn't. The once glorious Grande Army, which had marched into Russia like an unstoppable machine, was now a shuffling line of ghosts. Then came the Berezina River, a name that still haunts military historians and logistics officers everywhere. The French reached it in late November. The river was icy, wide, and the bridges, of course, had been destroyed by the Russians. Trapped between freezing water and enemy armies, Napoleon's engineers did what they could. They built makeshift bridges out of wagons, doors, and frozen desperation. Tens of thousands tried to cross at once. Horses slipped. Wagons collapsed, men drowned beneath sheets of ice, Russian cannons pounded the crossing. It was chaos, not the cinematic kind, but the absurd, nightmarish kind where every decision feels like a bad joke told by fate. Napoleon himself narrowly escaped across one of the bridges. Behind him, the remains of his army dissolved into panic. And then, as if to really drive the point home, the bridges broke. Thousands were left behind. In the end, Napoleon didn't need an enemy army to destroy him. Hunger, cold, and his own confidence did the job just fine. By the time what was left of the Grande Army staggered out of Russia, they were barely an army at all. Of the 600,000 who'd marched in, fewer than 100,000 made it out alive. And even those who survived carried scars, physical, mental, and culinary. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist when things went wrong, left his army before it even reached the border. He raced back to Paris to control the narrative, because if you can't win the war, at least you can spin the press. He told the French Senate it had been a brilliant campaign, which technically was true, if by brilliant you mean catastrophic and slow motion. Behind him, the survivors limped through Poland and Germany, leaving a trail of frostbitten footprints and bitter memories. The emperor had once promised them glory. They got hunger, humiliation, and a free lesson in thermodynamics. Historians still debate where exactly Napoleon's downfall began. Some say it was his ego, others his underestimation of Russian resilience. But honestly, it might have started with a missing sandwich, because the invasion of Russia wasn't lost in battle, it was lost in the kitchen. In supply wagons that never arrived, in fields that never yielded crops, in the arrogance that believed an empire could march forever without stopping to eat. And yet, the story doesn't end with Napoleon limping home. No, he came back because apparently the man didn't understand the concept of learn from your mistakes. But before we get to that encore, let's take one last look at the cost of hubris, not just in number, but in the quiet absurdity of an army that forgot the most basic of war. You can't conquer the world on an empty stomach. By the time Napoleon's army stumbled out of Russia, it didn't even look like an army. It looked like a rumor. The soldiers who'd once marched with shining uniform, polished muskets, now looked like ghosts in rags, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, and mumbling about bread like it was a religious vision. They had started the journey as Europe's most powerful fighting force. They ended it as proof that even empires can starve. When they crossed back into friendly territory, the local villagers didn't cheer. They stared. Because what walked past them wasn't victory returning home. It was survival limping in on what was left of its legs. Napoleon, of course, wasn't there to see most of it. He'd already rushed ahead to Paris, claiming urgent business, which is basically 19th century code for I'd like to get out before anyone notices how bad this looked. In Paris, he announced to the public that the campaign had been a strategic withdrawal, a maneuver, a temporary setback. He might as well have called it an unplanned Arctic vacation. The French newspapers dutifully printed his version, the sanitized imperial spin. But word of the disaster spread faster than he could rewrite it. Survivors limped home with stories that no amount of propaganda could bury. Soldiers freezing mid-step, horses collapsing in snow, comrades sharing the last crust of bread like a sacrament. The myth of Napoleon, the invincible genius, the untouchable emperor, started to crack. And once myths start cracking, they don't stop. Across Europe, the news was like blood in the water. Prussia, Austria, and Britain, who had spent years nursing their grudges, realized the unthinkable had happened. Napoleon could bleed. His army could fall apart. Suddenly, old alliances sparked back to life. Kings who'd been politely pretending to be neutral now smelled opportunity. And Russia? Russia was done playing defense. The Tsar, whose country Napoleon had burned and broken, sent his army marching west, not just to reclaim lost territory, but to chase the French all the way home. It was the beginning of the end. The dominoes started falling, one lost battle at a time, one abandoned ally after another. Within 2 years, the emperor who had ruled Europe like a chessboard was cornered, surrounded, and forced to abdicate. He'd gone from master of the continent to exile on a tiny island, staring at the sea and probably thinking, I really should have packed more food. And yet, here's where it gets interesting. Napoleon didn't see himself as defeated. He saw himself as temporarily inconvenienced. So after less than a year in exile, he came back. Literally escaped, returned to France, and tried again. Because of course he did. You have to admire the confidence or the complete lack of self-awareness. The man had lost 500,000 soldiers to cold, hunger, and denial, and still thought, you know what this world needs? Another round of... Spoiler, that comeback didn't last long either. But by then, Napoleon had cemented his legend, not just as a conqueror, but as history's most ambitious cautionary tale. Here's the thing. Napoleon wasn't stupid, far from it. He was one of the sharpest strategic minds in military history. He understood logistics, discipline, morale, on paper. But there's a difference between knowing how to move armies and understanding that armies are made of humans. Humans need food. They need warmth. They need rest. Empires tend to forget that part. Every great power, sooner or later, gets seduced by its own efficiency, starts believing that plans and glory and spreadsheets can replace basic reality. Napoleon's invasion of Russia was just the loudest example of that delusion in action. It's what happens when genius stops listening to common sense. The soldiers who returned from Russia never forgot. They called themselves the survivors of the snow. Many of them couldn't even describe what they'd seen. They'd just shake their heads, as if trying to wake from a bad dream that history refused to end. One officer later wrote, "We marched into Russia as conquerors and came back as skeletons." That line stuck. Because it wasn't just about the campaign, it was about the empire itself. Napoleon's France was already dying the same slow, hungry death as its army. It had eaten too much, too fast, too far. And when there was nothing left to consume, it collapsed under its own appetite. There's an old military saying, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Napoleon probably would have rolled his eyes at that until 1812. When his professionals froze to death waiting for bread that never arrived. And honestly, it's a lesson that still applies today. Grand plans fail not because they're bad ideas, but because someone forgot to ask, okay, but what are we eating? You can conquer territory, you can win battles, but if you forget the sandwiches, history will remember that, not your victories. So, what's the moral here? Maybe it's this. Greatness is hungry, literally and metaphorically, but if you don't feed it with humility, it eats itself. Napoleon didn't fall because his enemies outsmarted him. He fell because he thought he couldn't make a human mistake. He believed he could bend nature, time, and weather to his will. And nature, time, and weather all said, bet. The Russian winter didn't beat Napoleon. His own confidence did. And that's the absurd beauty of it. One of the smartest men in history lost everything because he forgot the simplest rule of survival. Not politics, not strategy, not revolution, just food. He remembered to bring cannons, horses, medals, marching bands, but not enough bread. So the next time someone tells you their plan is foolproof, just smile and ask, cool. But did Napoleon bring snacks? 2 centuries later, the road Napoleon took through Russia still exists. You can walk it, though, for obvious reasons few people do in winter. Along that endless stretch of frozen land, they still find things: buttons, coins, broken sabers, and sometimes bones. The remains of soldiers who never made it home, lying where hunger and frost stopped them for good. Every now and then, archaeologists uncover a campfire site, a black ring in the snow, fragments of tin cans, a few charred animal bones. It's eerie, but it tells a story that no official report could. Because in those ashes lies the most human detail of all: 600,000 men. And somewhere along the way, they stopped being soldiers and just became people trying to eat. If you visit Moscow today, you can find a plaque commemorating Napoleon's invasion. It doesn't brag or gloat. It simply states that this was the place where the invincible army met its match, which, to be fair, is a poetic way of saying nature dragged France by the ego. And if you go to France, there are monuments too, though they're quieter, because even now, Napoleon's Russian campaign isn't remembered as a triumph or a tragedy. It's remembered as a warning. The warning that no matter how powerful you are, you can still lose to the weather, or worse, to your own arrogance. What's funny, and yes, there's a kind of dark humor here, is that Napoleon wasn't the last to make this mistake. Not even close. A little over a century later, another European power looked at a map, looked at Russia, and said, how bad could it be? Cue World War II. Cue Operation Barbarossa. Cue the exact same disaster, but with tanks this time. And once again, an army that expected a quick victory got buried under snow, hunger, and history repeating itself like a cosmic joke. It's almost as if Russia keeps an open sign for invading armies that says, come on in, we're out of food and empathy. So, what is it about this story that still fascinates us? Maybe it's because it feels so painfully human. We all love stories of brilliance and victory, but failure, the really spectacular, overconfident, face-first into the ice kind, that's where humanity shows its true colors. Napoleon's campaign wasn't just a military disaster, it was a masterpiece of overreach, a reminder that genius without restraint becomes comedy. He tried to conquer nature, time, and distance, and ended up losing to hunger. He built an empire on ambition and forgot to bring lunch. There's something both tragic and hilarious about that. It's the kind of story you could tell around a campfire, if only the campfire didn't keep going out because you ran out of wood and morale. But there's another side to it, the quiet kind of irony, because even after all that, Napoleon didn't vanish. His legend grew. He became larger than life, the man who reshaped Europe, inspired revolutions, terrified kings. His failures, just like his victories, became myth. And maybe that's the real twist ending. Even when you forget the food, history will still feed on you. It'll turn your mistakes into lessons, your disasters into documentaries, and your hubris into content for YouTube channels 200 years later. So, next time you're watching some overconfident CEO promise to disrupt the world or a politician declare they can fix everything by Christmas, remember Napoleon? Remember that ambition is easy, logistics is hard, and that sometimes the only thing standing between greatness and catastrophe is lunch. There's a rumor, probably exaggerated like all good rumors, that after returning from Russia, Napoleon once remarked, "An army marches on its stomach." If he really said it, that's either the greatest case of hindsight in history or the most tragic cell phone ever recorded. Either way, it's the kind of quote that deserves to be carved on every boardroom wall, war college door, and maybe even the fridge. Feed your empire, because history doesn't forgive hunger or hubris. And that's the story of how one of the most brilliant men who ever lived led one of the greatest armies ever assembled into one of the coldest, hungriest, most avoidable disasters in history. Napoleon didn't lose to Russia. He lost to reality. So if you enjoyed this story of overconfidence, logistics, and frozen ambition, hit that like button, subscribe, and join us next time on History Oops, where we explore more real moments in history that make you go, wait, they did what?